10:05 in the morning, on the last Saturday of June, the Delacroy family, mother, father, and 3 kids, the youngest just 12 years old, stepped onto the South Kaibab Trailhead at the Grand Canyon, each carrying a single 1-liter bottle of water, and started down toward the Colorado River. Their reasoning, discussed the night before over dinner at their hotel, had felt sound at the time. The river was down there. They'd refill when they got close. No need to carry more than that. By early afternoon, the youngest of the 3 children was unconscious on the trail, roughly halfway down, in triple-digit heat, more than 4 miles from any water source her family actually had access to. Marcus and Elena Delacroix, both in their early 40s, had brought their 3 children, Noah, 16, Chloe, 14, and the youngest, Ava, 12, on a 2-week road trip through the American Southwest, the kind of ambitious multi-park itinerary many families attempt once every few years. The Grand Canyon, then onto Zion, then Bryce, checking off national parks the way some families check off theme parks. They were an active family by ordinary suburban standards, weekend bike rides, a couple of moderate day hikes back home in a state with a considerably milder climate, Noah on his high school's cross-country team. None of them had any real experience with true desert heat, and none of them had ever attempted anything close to a rim-to-rim or rim-to-river hike at the Grand Canyon before. Marcus had read about the South Kaibab Trail online in the weeks before the trip, one of the 2 main corridor trails descending from the South Rim toward the Colorado River, steeper and more exposed than its counterpart, Bright Angel Trail, but shorter in distance to the river. He'd seen photos, read a few blog posts from other visitors describing the hike down as strenuous but doable, and settled on a plan: hike down to the river, see it up close, then hike back up the same way. Roughly 14 miles round trip, with over 4,700 feet of elevation change. He had not read, or had read and not fully absorbed, the specific and repeated warnings the National Park Service publishes about this exact hike, that the Park Service explicitly discourages attempting a hike to the river and back in a single day during summer months, that the South Kaibab Trail in particular has no shade and no water sources anywhere along its length, and that inner canyon summer temperatures routinely exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The plan came together casually, the way a lot of ambitious vacation days do, over dinner the evening before. Someone raised the question of water, how much to bring for a hike this long. Marcus's answer became the operating assumption for the entire next day. We don't need to carry a ton. The river's down there. We'll just fill up when we get close. It was, on its face, not an unreasonable-sounding piece of logic. The Colorado River is, in fact, at the bottom of the canyon, visible from parts of the trail well before hikers reach it. What the reasoning missed, in a way that would prove entirely decisive, was the difference between water existing somewhere in the canyon and water being accessible to hikers at the point in the hike when they actually need it. The South Kaibab Trail, specifically chosen for this hike because of its shorter distance, has no maintained water sources anywhere along its route, no spigots, no ranger-monitored refill stations, nothing between the trailhead and the river itself, a fact printed clearly on the park's own trail information and posted at the trailhead. Reaching the river down there meant reaching the very bottom of a 4,700-foot descent before any refill was possible at all, which also meant that for the entire outbound leg of the hike, the only water available to any of them was whatever they carried down from the rim, 1 liter each for 5 people. For a hike the park's own guidance estimates can take 4 to 5 hours downhill alone in cooler months, considerably longer in extreme summer heat, before any climb back out even begins. They set out a little after 10 in the morning, already, by park guidance standards, dangerously late for a summer inner canyon hike, which the National Park Service specifically recommends beginning before sunrise to complete the most exposed sections before the day's peak heat arrives. The temperature at the rim when they started was a comfortable 78 degrees, mild enough that none of the 5 felt any immediate sense of urgency or concern. Ava, the youngest, was excited, chatting with Chloe as they started down the switchbacks, taking photos of the layered rock formations opening up below them. The early portion of the South Kaibab Trail descends quickly through a series of exposed switchbacks with almost no shade at any point, a deliberate design that offers spectacular, unobstructed views in exchange for zero shelter from direct sun, a trade-off that matters enormously depending on the time of year and the time of day a hiker chooses to be on it. By 11 a.m., less than an hour in, the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees and continued rising steadily as the family descended further into the canyon, each 1,000 feet of elevation lost, adding roughly 5 more degrees to the ambient heat, a compounding effect that meant the deepest, hottest sections of the trail were also the ones furthest from any way back to cooler conditions. By noon, the family had covered close to 3 miles, roughly the halfway point in distance to the river, though considerably less than halfway in terms of remaining effort, given how much steeper and hotter the trail's lower sections would become. The heat by this point was intense in a way that surprised all 5 of them, a dry, radiant heat radiating up off the exposed rock and trail surface, in addition to beating down from a sun now near its highest point, with temperatures at this elevation in the canyon climbing past 105 degrees. All 5 had been drinking steadily since the start, without any specific rationing plan between them, the same instinct-based approach that fails so often in genuinely extreme heat. Drink when thirsty, without tracking consumption against remaining distance or remaining hours of exposure. By noon, most of the bottles were already less than a third full. Ava's, given to the smallest member of the family with the least ability to physically carry a larger reserve, even if one had been packed, was nearly empty. Elena noticed first that Ava had gone quiet, not her usual talkative self on the trail, walking with her head down, answering questions with single words. When asked directly how she was feeling, Ava said she had a headache and felt kind of sick to her stomach, a combination Elena registered as concerning but not yet alarming, attributing it in the moment to the exertion and unfamiliar heat rather than to anything more serious already underway. They stopped in a small patch of partial shade cast by an overhanging rock, rested for close to 15 minutes, and gave Ava what remained of her own water, along with a portion from Chloe's bottle. By the time they resumed walking, Ava's body had already crossed further into a physiological process that the family had no specific framework to recognize for what it actually was. Sweating is the body's primary mechanism for shedding excess heat, but it depends entirely on adequate fluid volume to sustain. And Ova, smaller than the rest of her family and given the least total water from the outset, had been running a larger relative fluid deficit than any of them for the better part of 2 hours. As her blood volume dropped, her body faced a compounding problem: less fluid available to produce sweat and less blood volume available to carry heat from her body's core out to the skin's surface where it could be released at all. Her headache, nausea, and unusual quiet were the early, still reversible signs of this process: heat exhaustion, treatable with rest, shade, and enough fluid and time to allow her body's systems to recover. The stop under the rock overhang had helped, briefly, but the water given to her there was a fraction of what her body actually needed to meaningfully reverse the deficit already built up, and the trail ahead offered no shade, no cooling, and no additional water at any point before the river, still well over a mile of steep, exposed switchbacks below them. Within 20 minutes of resuming the hike, Ava's condition began deteriorating rapidly rather than gradually. The specific, dangerous transition from heat exhaustion into heat stroke, the point at which the body's cooling systems stop merely struggling and begin failing outright. She stopped sweating almost entirely, her skin turning hot and dry despite the extreme exertion and ambient heat, one of the clearest and most serious signs of heat stroke, though not one any of her family had specific training to recognize as urgent rather than simply she stopped sweating, at least that's something. She began stumbling, her coordination visibly affected, answering questions with increasing confusion. Marcus, growing seriously alarmed now, picked her up to carry her the remaining distance toward whatever help might be reachable, while Elena searched frantically for any cell signal to call for emergency assistance, coverage that in this section of the inner canyon was non-existent. Less than 10 minutes after Marcus began carrying her, Ava lost consciousness entirely. Her heat stroke had progressed to the point where her core body temperature, no longer being regulated by any functioning cooling mechanism, continued climbing even as her physical exertion had effectively stopped, carried rather than walking, her body no longer generating the muscular heat of hiking, but still radiating and absorbing more heat than it could release, in an environment that offered no external source of cooling at all. Marcus laid her down in what little shade the trail offered, elevated by nothing but the packs the family hastily arranged beneath her, while Elena ran ahead down the trail, phone held out in front of her, searching for even a single bar of signal. Noah, the oldest, ran in the opposite direction, back up toward the rim, on the chance that returning toward the trailhead, still miles away and thousands of feet above them, might reach help faster than continuing down toward the river, a decision made in genuine uncertainty about which direction actually offered the better odds, in a situation where neither option was fast. Chloe stayed with her father and her sister, doing the only thing available to any of them, without water, shade, or signal, pouring what little liquid remained across Ava's forehead, wrists, and neck, trying to cool her by any means available, while Marcus checked over and over for a pulse that remained present but was growing faster and weaker. In the roughly 70 minutes between Ava's collapse and the point when help finally reached the family, her body was undergoing a cascade that, past a certain threshold, becomes exceptionally difficult to reverse even with full medical intervention, let alone with nothing more than a damp cloth and shade from an overhanging rock. Once core body temperature climbs above roughly 104 degrees Fahrenheit and remains elevated for a sustained period, cellular damage begins accumulating throughout the body. Proteins within cells begin to denature, the same basic process that happens to an egg white under heat, disrupting normal cellular function throughout tissues and organs. The brain, among the most heat-sensitive organs in the body, is affected early and severely, which is why altered mental status, confusion, and eventual loss of consciousness are hallmark signs of heat stroke's progression rather than a separate, unrelated symptom. None of this requires additional exertion to continue progressing. Ava was not walking, not exerting herself in any way during the entire 70 minutes her family fought to help her, and her condition continued to worsen regardless, because the underlying problem was no longer about activity. It was about a core temperature that had climbed high enough to begin damaging her body from the inside, with no mechanism left, external or internal, capable of bringing it back down quickly enough. Elena eventually found a single bar of intermittent signal roughly a quarter-mile down the trail, enough to connect an emergency call to Grand Canyon Dispatch. Park rangers, coordinating with an emergency helicopter crew, were dispatched immediately, given the severity described and the remote, inaccessible nature of the trail section involved. The helicopter reached the family a little over 30 minutes after the call connected, a fast response by any standard for a location this remote within the canyon. Paramedics began immediate and aggressive cooling and resuscitation efforts on scene, exactly the kind of intervention that, delivered soon enough after the onset of heat stroke, can and often does save lives. It was not soon enough. Despite the rapid response and the paramedics' efforts, Ava could not be revived. She was pronounced dead at the scene, less than 4 hours after her family had stepped onto the trail with a single liter of water each and the belief that the river, somewhere below them, would be close enough to matter in time. The Grand Canyon does not distinguish between an experienced desert hiker and a 12-year-old on a family vacation. It responds only to what a person actually carries, and when, against an environment that gives no accommodation for good intentions once the heat and the distance have already done their work.